at the same time, they started really expanding in India, and few people know this history. So please take it away, Mother.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Felix. And thanks, Camilla and Chris, for inviting me to give this talk. As you know, I'm fairly new to the Radical Anthropology group, but it's something right up my street. And it's very heartening to know that a group like this exists, where people are talking about anthropology in a radical way, as it should be. So as Felix said, I'm right now doing my DPhil on Indigenous politics in Ecuador. And so the presentation today is not going to be a part of it's not from my DPhil at all. Yeah, it's to do with the work which I did in India over many years, where I started working with a small organization in Bhopal, which works with tribal people in central India. And then I went on to do my MPhil in education studies, where I wrote a thesis about indigenous education policy in India since independence. Can you hear me all right? I could hear some feedback, but can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Anybody who's got a microphone, I'll maybe mute it, apart from Malvika.
Okay. So, so I wrote my MPhil thesis on the Adivasi education policy in India, and I should state this now. I'd be using the words indigenous and Adivasi interchangeably. Adivasi is a term which indigenous people in India use to refer to themselves, and it basically means original dwellers. So I wrote my MPhil thesis on that, and since then, Felix and I have been working together, looking especially at the issue of residential schools in India, and really traveling the length and breadth of the country, seeing all kinds of state schools, schools run by NGOs, initiatives, Adivasi's own initiatives, etc. So, and at the outset, I'd also really like to thank Felix because he's been great to work together, and he's been quite an amazing intellectual and political companion in this journey, which is quite a hard journey, as you will find out as I go on. And now the other big question is why the need to talk about residential schools now at this moment? So the world's biggest boarding school is in India, in Orissa, in the capital of Orissa, Bhubaneswar. It claims to be, it calls itself an anthropology laboratory and has about 30,000 Adivasi children studying there from 62 tribes of Orissa, which is an eastern state in India. And this school, this organization is due to host the World Anthropology Congress in 2023, which is annually organized by IUES, which I imagine this audience would be familiar with, International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences. And this raises a lot of questions. This has caused great alarm amongst lots of Adivasi and non-Adivasi academics, activists, organizations in India, people working on indigenous issues in Britain, and people are very concerned about this. So I'm going to talk about the school towards the end of my talk, and I would like to think collectively with you all about what you think, whether an organization like this is appropriate for hosting an anthropology congress. So I'd begin by saying, okay, why talk about school? This book played quite an important role in my life, because when I was working in Bhopal, I came across this book in its Hindi translation. It's a book which questions schooling. It's a book which makes a difference between education and schooling, which are often seen synonymously. And it's a beautiful book, illustrated. It's a sort of a graphic non-fiction kind of book, and the illustrations are done by a Brazilian illustrator called Claudius. And in India and a lot of other what we call third world countries, there is often a relationship made between poverty alleviation and or poverty eradication and education are seen as this great means to alleviate poverty. So this book traces history of schooling in the world, and it draws our attention to the fact that actually education reproduces inequality, as Bourdieu talked about it in 70s. And it makes us question all the hope that's placed on schooling, and makes this distinction between schooling and education. So, and as you can see in this graphic, it's sort of showing how education, contributes to creation of an elite, and what happens to the different classes, the children of different classes, and how they are sort of funneled out to a garbage heap, the children of industrial and agricultural workers, let alone tribal people. Another thing why education is extremely important is that it's a sphere. Schooling is an institution where you see the spheres of culture and economy interlinking, because often when we speak about indigenous people in essentialization terms, one only speaks of indigenous people's culture without actually seriously thinking about the political structures of their society, or the economics of their society. So education is one sort of space where we clearly see these two spheres interlinking. Education also is extremely relevant because it raises a lot of questions about knowledge, and it raises questions about politics of knowledge and knowledge debates. What is valid knowledge? What is not valid knowledge? Whose knowledge is considered to be valid and who's not? And I think it's relevant to talk about it at the moment, especially given what's happening in England, in the world, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and especially here with the Roads Must Fall movement, where not only are people, raising questions about representation of diverse peoples in the curriculum, or representation of diverse peoples in the academy, but also taking it a step forward to begin to question the very cognitive architecture on which universities are based today, and how they systematically neglect certain forms of knowledge. And finally, education not only has the potential, has the capacity to deculturalize people, but as well as it deterritorializes people. And we see some of that, especially in the case of education of Adivasis. Okay, and Linda Toohey-Smith, again, who's a big inspiration, and I'm pretty sure this audience is very familiar with her work, says very rightly that for many indigenous peoples, the main agency for imposing positional superiority over knowledge, language, and culture was colonial education. And we'll be thinking about this through the presentation. Then why indigenous people in India? Often when I, being an Indian studying here, when you just have lay conversations with people, one thing they would still be familiar with about India is the caste system, but not many people know about the tribal situation, the situation of tribal peoples in India at all. And I think it's important to clarify that there are 100 million tribal people in India. It's the largest population of indigenous peoples in the world. There are about 700 Adivasi groups. And I'm going to be speaking about the Adivasis, who are mainly in the central and eastern belt of India, and I won't be speaking about the northeast of India, which is a very different situation. When we speak about tribal people in India, one thing we notice is that the whole discourse is sort of shrouded in poverty, or it's kind of there's an overwhelming attention on deficit discourse, seeing tribal people as poor. So in B.D. Sharma, who was a very strong activist on tribal issues in India, and he was the commissioner of Scheduled Tribes and Scheduled Castes Commission in India in the 1980s, very strongly said that it's incorrect to call tribal people poor. They're not poor, they are disinherited. So he sort of brings in, he basically throws light on the question of power dynamics and how tribal people came to be poor, and makes us think about the dispossession of that has taken place, dispossession from land and forest, and the sort of economic exploitation that has gone on in India, more so since independence. And then in talking about all this, I must also clarify that my positionality in terms of being not an Adivasi myself, and yet engaging with these issues. Here I draw inspiration from the idea of indigenous standpoint epistemology, which makes us think about what indigeneity is. Does one express indigeneity only by being born indigenous, or can you also through working hard, through opening your mind, through a lot of self-awareness, and making an effort to learn values of indigenous people, can you also strive to be indigenous? So it's a very contentious issue, but I open it up and I put it out there. I'm happy to take it up in discussion. Now, I'd basically in this talk be looking at the history of Adivasi education in India, and looking at how we can summarize the history of Adivasi education in one word, and that is assimilation. One of the latest very strong Indian government reports on the tribal situation in India, which came out in 2014 and was totally suppressed by the Indian government of that time, is called the Khaka Committee report, which was chaired by a very highly respected indigenous person who is an extremely respected scholar, a sociologist. And one of the things he says in his analysis of the tribal situation in India in 2014 is that all India has done in the name of integration is assimilation in the last 70 years. So to explain this, I would begin by saying that at the time of independence, India, while it was thinking about the tribal question, had sort of two choices. There were these two poles of India going the way of assimilation, which would mean that the tribal policy going on the path of assimilation, which would mean that the tribal people would be absorbed in the mainstream, as it's called in the Indian discourse. Or the other extreme was that of isolation, which was to say that you leave tribal people on their own, and let there be no contact between them and the rest of the world. And what was decided at that time under Nehru's leadership was that, okay, we are not going to follow the path of assimilation or integration or isolation, but we are going to follow the middle path of integration, which means you really try and have a dialogue between two different knowledge systems, two different ways of being, different ways of different economic systems, and you actually facilitate an equal dialogue with them. That was in words, and Nehru spelled out India has not had a tribal policy as such, but Nehru spelled out his tribal policy in 5 principles in the foreword to a book of somebody called Verrier Elvin, who I will come to in a bit. And he says that tribal people should be allowed to develop according to their own genius. And there should be minimal interference of non-tribal administrators in tribal areas, and so on. So he had all these beautiful words in thinking about the tribal policy at that time, which also encapsulated the idea of integration. But he himself completely contradicted uh, these ideas by also saying at the same time that dams are the temples of modern India, and was crucial in facilitating large-scale iron ore mining in places like Chhattisgarh and related dam projects, etc. So in this context, the Khaka Committee report in 2014 says that basically in the name of integration, what has happened is assimilation, and education has had a massive role to play in it. And if we try and think about this in terms of what happened in North America, sorry.
That's could you switch off your microphone, please?
Okay, thank you. Just a minute.
Yeah, shall I go on?
Of course, yes.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So I was saying that if we think about it in the context of what happened in North America and Australia in the 19th and 20th centuries, we see that there is a clear analysis, there's a clear acceptance, acknowledgement, acceptance, and analysis followed by apologies of the assimilative process of education with respect to indigenous peoples in these countries. And at that time in North America, in 1800s, assimilation was actually seen something to be very proud of, because it was being proposed in opposition to the policy of extermination. And they came up with a subtle form of violence, which was with General Henry Pratt, who set up the first Indian industrial school, Carlisle School, whose picture again you'll see a bit later on, called "Kill the Indian to Save the Man." So the difference between North America, Australia, and India with respect to the assimilation policy is that in India, there was an absolute silence and absence of acknowledgement of this happening. However, this is what went on in terms of tribal education, and that's what I'm going to show through the history. And assimilation was of two kinds. Assimilation was in India was assimilating tribal people into the Hindu nationalist ideology. As a lot of you would know, Modi is the Prime Minister of India. BJP has been in power for 2 terms, and the sister organization of BJP, Modi's party, is the RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the Hindu nationalist cultural organization, and it has played a massive role in tribal education in India, and in terms of running all different kinds of schools and hostels. So assimilation in India happened in 2 ways. One would be in terms of assimilating into the Hindu nationalist ideology, and the other would be into the industrial mode of production. And I would again go into it a bit later. These 3 books are excellent. So anybody who's interested in knowing more about the boarding schools and the residential schools history of North America would probably like to have a look at them. And these 2 films are fantastic as well. One of them is again about the stories of boarding school survivors in Canada, and the other one very beautifully traces the story of an Aboriginal boy in Australia who faces huge difficulties in school, whose grandmother is really worried about the fact that he's not learning languages, he's not learning his own language, and is not, and he's a great healer. And you see lots of scenes in the film where he is doing that healing to his family members, but is absolutely not, which is absolutely not recognized at school. So again, the question of what knowledge form is valid and what is not. This, I think, is a repetition. So now I would go straight into the history of tribal education. So as I said, when I was doing the MPhil, the way to understand the discourse on tribal education in India was to look at the key government reports on tribes and key government reports on education, and to then map the two together, map the discourse by looking at the two together. So I would just quickly run through some of the texts, some of the reports that I looked at. I looked at the Constituent Assembly debates on the 5th and 6th schedule. I won't go into what the 5th and 6th schedule is, but it is to do with the autonomy of tribal areas in India, in central India and northeastern India. And when you look at the Constituent Assembly debates, there are these 4 characters who play a very important role. The first one is Thakkar Bapa, who was a Gandhian, but in practice and was sort of almost recruited by Gandhi to go and work in tribal areas, but was absolutely anti-Gandhian in his practice. Gandhi in 1930s had prepared a very elaborate scheme of education, which he called the Nai Talim, or basic education. And the 2 or 3 main principles of his system of education were that all children should have receive education in their mother tongue. The second one was that productive work, working with one's hands, should be at the center of the curriculum, and all learning of other academic disciplines should happen through productive work. And Thakkar Bapa absolutely disregarded these principles, and in fact we can understand where he was coming from by looking at some of his own words. This is from a speech that he gave in 1941 on the Aboriginal situation in India at the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics in Pune in Maharashtra, Western state. And he says the Adivasi is proverbially lazy in addition to being illiterate. They are very attached to shifting cultivation, which requires much less labor and than plow cultivation. And if it is desired to make an Adivasi a hardworking citizen, it is necessary to tackle the Adivasi child first. Hence the necessity for residential vocational schools, where the child can be molded into an industrious citizen. So you can see that the seeds of residential schools were being sowed as these discussions were happening before independence, and which sort of crystallized the Constituent Assembly and the policies that were formed by the post-colonial Indian state. And then he goes on talking about tribal people as being backward and who need to be uplifted, etc. How can the Aborigines realize their present backwardness and work for their economic, social and political progress if there is no contact with people more advanced than themselves? So the other character in the story is Verrier Elvin, who is an Englishman, studied in Oxford, studied theology, went to India, almost had many different avatars in his life, was doing some religious work at first, got disillusioned by that, went to Gandhi's ashram in Pune, did something there, and finally ended up in central India, where he lived for about 30 years, trying to understand tribal society and writing about it as an anthropologist would, without having any training in anthropology, and has written some of the most fantastic and inspiring ethnographies of that time. And Verrier Elvin was appointed by Nehru as the first tribal affairs advisor to the Indian government. And there are all these, so that was Elvin. And then the third person is Jaipal Singh Munda, who is an Adivasi, who also came to Oxford to do his undergraduate degree, and went back. He was from Jharkhand. He went back to India, which is a tribal state in India, and went back to India and participated in the Constituent Assembly debates. And he gets into a spat with Thakkar Bapa, and he says, Thakkar, how many Adivasi languages do you speak? Because Gandhi thinks that all education of children should happen in their mother tongue. How many, and you run all these schools in tribal areas, so how many Adivasi languages do you speak? And Thakkar admits honestly none. And he tells him, he kind of, you know, gently says to him that I'm glad you're honest enough to admit that you don't know a single Adivasi language. I would venture to suggest that if his workers were to learn the language of the people, I think someone's microphone is on again. Their work would be more valuable. So this is an exchange between Thakkar and Jaipal Singh. And going back to Elwin drafted a very significant report in 1960s, which is known as Elwin Committee Report, and about education. He first of all tackles the issue of calling tribal people backward and using the sort of, you know, the ideas of uplift to talk about them, and which were absolutely underlined by a social evolutionary kind of paradigm. And so he questions that, and he asks, who is backward? The simple, honest tribesman, or the merchant who exploits him? And with respect to education, he says that that if the modern system of education was to see the indigenous systems of education as allies instead of seeing them as rivals, we could genuinely move towards a genuine path of integration. And this was completely ignored. So this was a report which came out in 1960. In 1966 came out the Kothari Commission report, which is the first comprehensive report on education in India, which basically, again, as you can see on the slide, draws on Gandhi's ideas, but subverts Gandhi's idea of work to propose an education which prepares students to for a society which is on the path of industrialization, and essentializes tribal people by saying, oh yes, they are fond of vocational courses, and maybe, you know, they should be given vocational training in polytechniques and so on, so that they could do these jobs which are required for India to grow as an industrial economy. I did not talk about G.S. Ghurye, the last actor in this whole story, who was a very influential Indian sociologist, studied at Cambridge. And I don't know, there's something here to think about why a lot of these voices were coming from Oxford and Cambridge, and the sort of politics of knowledge there as well. And he called tribal people backward Hindus, and sort of lay the ground for a lot of thinking that RSS, the Hindu nationalist organization, did, in terms of both thinking and their practice. So finally, in terms of residential schools, they were called ashram schools in India. The state-run residential schools were called ashram schools. And Khaka Committee report, which I mentioned earlier, apart from saying that what India has done in the name of integration is assimilation, also says that in the name of Adivasi education, what's basically happened is ashramization of education. And Ramamurthy Committee report, which was a 1990 report, says that the kind of community life and production work-based education envisaged in the Gandhian model of ashram shalas are significantly missing in the government-founded ashram schools run for the benefit of the scheduled tribes. And now I would also link this back with the larger theme of assimilation. So what one understands in the Indian context is that, the various actors over time have changed. The faces have changed because education being started by, in tribal areas, being provided by missionaries, to then later on the Indian state taking on that role at the time of independence and running these ashram shalas, boarding schools in India, to the RSS playing an important role. And they've all basically done assimilation in one form or the other, although the faces have changed. And the latest entrant to this glorious list are the extractive industries, and which is something one can try and understand with the help of this idea given by a Canadian educationist, anthropologist in British Columbia, who writes in a paper about extraction education in the context of the curriculum in British Columbia being aligned with the needs of an LNG, liquefied natural gas plant there. And I think it has a lot of resonance with what's happening in India. So basically to align education with resource extraction industries. As I mentioned at the beginning, I am doing my DPhil on indigenous politics in Ecuador. And I'm trying to understand how Ecuador came to be a plurinational and intercultural state, how it came to recognize itself as a plurinational and intercultural state in 2008 in relation to the decades-long, very strong movement of indigenous peoples whose demands for interculturality and plurinationality was a big part of their organization, and finally the state came to understand it. But I'm not going to talk about that anymore in the presentation yet. From now on, I will be drawing on Ecuador a little bit to speak about the time when Correa was the president of Ecuador. And he was seen as somebody who was speaking about socialism of the 21st century, etc., talking about Buen Vivir, Suma Causai. People who work in Latin America are very familiar with these terms, plans of good living and so on. But economically, he was still basing Ecuador's development project on extraction. And in the 5 models of extraction education that I have outlined here, one sees similarities with some of the models that we see in Ecuador with what we see in India. So I would go through them quickly. The first 4 pertain to India. So the first kind of model you see is that of state mining companies such as National Mineral Development Corporation, which has had a long presence in Chhattisgarh since 60s, doing large-scale iron ore mining. So you see a state mining company opening schools through its corporate social responsibility programs. So here you have a picture of an education city in Chhattisgarh, which has basically been set up with NMDC money. The second model that you see is of private mining companies such as Adani setting up their own schools in tribal areas. So an example of this would be Adani Vidya Mandir in Sarguja district. And one needs to also understand, this is a picture of a protest in Australia. One needs to understand the role of Adani, not just in India, but globally, and especially as is probably familiar to many people here, the big controversy about Adani coal mining in Australia, which poses threat to the Great Barrier Reef, and the role of and Adani now playing a role in education. And the third one is Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences, which I would again go into more detail in a bit, but it's a model where you see a lot of different mining companies funding it partly, mining companies like Adani, Vedanta, which has been an extremely controversial mining company in the Indian case, against which a landmark case was won by the tribal people of Orissa called the Dongria Coans. It's really it was a historic win, and they voted unanimously against against bauxite mining, and Felix has been very much involved with that, so he can probably come in on that later. So a lot of these mining companies partly funding the school, partly the school sort of runs on this cross subsidization model where there's a big parent institution or a sister organization actually called Kalinga Institute of Industrial Technology, whose money goes into KISS, and then you have these mining companies, and you also have some money coming in from the government. So you see this is sort of public-private partnership. The fourth one is a private-private partnership where recently KISS and Adani came together to set up schools in Orissa. The final one is the model which comes from Ecuador, which is called Millennium Schools or Escuelas del Milenio, where although Ecuador's institutionalized a system of intercultural and bilingual education in 1988 in the state after a long struggle of the indigenous movement, Correa comes to the president. Correa comes to power, and he orders closing down of a lot of these schools, and instead opens these big escuelas del milenio. So this is a picture of one of them, and here you see a graph which was Correa's propaganda to see as mining increases, schools would increase. So it's that same sort of ideology. And here you see that, you know, children, I mean, yeah, Adani's culpability in environmental destruction, and you have these children sort of at Adani's school talking about save environment. So it's sort of the irony of that. So yeah, so the extractive industries are the latest entrant in this whole story of assimilation. And these are pictures of a small-scale intercultural bilingual education school in Ecuador. Now I come to Kalinga Institute of Social Science. I'd like to play this 1-minute video.
We're not hearing the amazing soundtrack, Madhika.
Sorry.
This video's got a very, very strong soundtrack that's this transforming social liabilities into change agents of society and so
on. Thanks, Felix, for pointing that out. I'm sorry you couldn't hear the. Yeah. These are some the soundtrack, but it's like a really jarring soundtrack. Anyway, and so here you have. These are more pictures of KISS, and you sort of juxtapose this with the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, and we can discuss this in the discussion. This is Achyut Samanta, who is the founder of the school, who has been described as a merchant of hope. There's a big kind of martyrdom story which goes around Samanta coming from a poor family and has sacrificed himself to serve the tribal people without actually caring to understand what tribal life or different Adivasi groups think, feel, or do. So that's him. And then these are more pictures of the school. This is another picture of the school where you see a big temple in the background. And as I said earlier on, we need to think about assimilation in India along two tracks of assimilating into a Hindu nationalist ideology, as well as assimilating into an industrial mode of life. And you really see a marriage of the two in this school. And this is the school, by the way, again, to remind you, which is due to host the World Anthropology Congress in 2023. There's been a lot of, it's been slow, but a lot of critique is emerging of the school from different places, from very strong Adivasi activists, non-Adivasi activists, a lot of them very dear friends, and by Survival International, an organization which a lot of you might be familiar with, which presented, which prepared a report on a global report on the situation of boarding schools in indigenous areas in the world. And one of its main case studies is on this school, and Survival calls it a factory school. And so there's a lot of critique coming from, yeah, as I said, different quarters. There was a report by the Child Welfare Committee in India, which did a sort of inspection and highlighted just very basic sort of, violations of human rights in terms of how children are living in congested living spaces, and the food wasn't nutritious. Children being reported of having tuberculosis, and so on. Again, related to this is a whole issue of physical, sexual, mental, emotional, let alone spiritual abuse of tribal children in residential schools in India. And there are several media reports which come up with horrific numbers of this sort of abuse being rampant in these schools. So again, I think with the sort of announcement of my talk, you would have seen a picture of all children wearing these Colgate hats and brushing their teeth given to them by Colgate. So Colgate, Kellogg, and these companies are sponsors of different kinds in different ways. And then you sort of, juxtapose this sort of education with what Madhu Ramnath in his very powerful book says here, that these schools, he's not talking about extractive industry schools, but he's talking about other kind of residential schools, and says these schools alienate Adivasi youth from their society, creating prejudices. This shows in the Adivasi boys who refuse to return to their forest villages during vacations. They are ashamed to acknowledge their parents and their Adivasi background, attempting at becoming poor imitations of the non-tribal. These schools distance Adivasi children from the forest as a place of learning. Few years at school are enough for Adivasi children to develop a tendency to shirk physical labor. Day scholars become burdens on their families. So, he highlights a lot of cross-cutting issues here, where you sort of see a break in any kind of intergenerational learning. And a scholar called Sharda Balgopalan calls this phenomena, children are neither of the homes nor the fields. So these kind of these aspirations are false aspirations, are constructed of sort of this green life on the other side once they go to the cities, but they sort of are left nowhere because they look down, they start looking down on their families, and they are looked down by the mainstream society in any case, which does not accept them, and so on. And we can talk about a lot of these things in the.
I think you should wind up because there's just 40 minutes left for questions.
Sure. Yeah, I'm coming to an end very soon. And I'd end with, so you see a lot of distancing of children from their families, from their culture, from their languages, from their, ways of being, their worldviews, their uh, ways of thinking, being, doing, sort of integrated, and a divorce from that. And then on the other side, you have schools like Imli Mahua, you have schools, which is this school, you have schools like Muskan in central India, you have schools like the one run by an organization called Bachpan Banao. And so just to go into this one school, it's in Chhattisgarh, and this school has sort of grown up along the way and started out with Gandhi's idea of Nai Talim, but engaged with it along the way and decided to do different things at different points of time instead of holding on to this one idea, depending on what the reality of that environment required. So the school uses multiple languages: Hindi, Halbi, Gondi, which are indigenous languages, and English. And it's sort of run on this whole principle, on a democratic principle, where the teachers and children together decide what they would like to do. And there's a lot of emphasis on manual work, on learning different skills of growing food, pottery, etc. So here you see one of the teachers of the school is a potter, and this is them growing food. And yeah, and just, yeah, also I won't go into the other two schools, but again we can talk about that in the discussion, and sort of leaving linking the idea of assimilation with these two main phenomena of linguistic genocide, which Skatnap Kangas talks about in his powerful book, and of epistemicide, against which Santos proposes understanding epistemologies of the South, and basing our education on epistemologies of the South, and not just seeing these epistemologies of the South being relevant the South or to indigenous communities, but as something which can help us rethink the global order and global economy at large. Linda Tugivai-Smith, a book, her book Decolonizing Methodologies, I'm quite sure everybody's familiar with. And finally, I'm going to leave you here with a poem by a very strong Adivasi scholar, activist, leader, and whatnot, who recently passed away, who's a dear friend of many of us. And I just leave you here with his words. Yeah, and I would actually finally close by saying two more things, that in terms of moving on and thinking about decoloniality, I think it is time that we talk about questions of social justice, economic justice, in relation with epistemic justice. These cannot be seen separately. And the second thing in my field, during my fieldwork in Ecuador, which I learned, which I think could be quite relevant for us in India to learn from, is the sort of the equality that you see within the movement in terms of talking about issues of extractivism, land, territory, and education. And and as far as I understand, the movements, the social movements in India, are absolutely exemplary and very strong in what they have achieved. But one thing where I feel where we could learn from is by linking issues of land, forest, and education together. Because if we try and look at the world from the point of view of tribal people, these do not exist in silos or as separated, but it's a whole. So yeah, that's about it, I think, from me. Yeah, I'm going to exit the slide because it's very odd. This is the first time I'm giving a presentation on Zoom, and it's very odd talking to a screen and not being able to see people's faces. And relating to people. It's very, very alienating, but that's what we have at the moment. So yeah, thank you.
Can we see everybody, please? Can you exit your shared screen, Malvika?
Yeah.
Great. Well, that was a fantastically powerful talk, and it's just shocking that so few of us know anything about it all. I had no idea about that vast, horrendous, corporate governed so-called school, which is really evidently a factory for destroying people and starting with their minds, and no doubt ending up with destroying their bodies and lives as well. So we've got half an hour. I imagine, Felix, you want to follow up a bit. Is that right, Felix?
Yeah, I think it'll be good if Felix shares a few thoughts, and then both of us could lead the discussion together and take on questions.
Okay, I mean, that was a fantastic presentation. I want to say very, very few things. One is that at the moment, some of us are taking on KISS, and led by some people in India. And it's bringing up enormous fear in all of us, because KISS is more aggressive than you can possibly imagine. So each of us has been attacked personally, not actually Malvika yet, but it is really quite, and the link with mining companies and politics is quite kind of dirty. Sorry, here I am. I wanted to say too, like, the history that Malvika has tried to summarize is in a way a far more complicated history than the one we know of from North America and Australia, because of the caste system. So actually, missionaries started schools for tribal kids in India the same time as they did in New Zealand, Australia, North America. But there, the aim was to create a tribal elite, while in a way, from the beginning in America, it was to do assimilation. But now in India, with the right to education and the right or duty of every child to go to school, the aim is the same as it was. This is my interpretation in North America, Australia, to do assimilation. And the abuse that's happening, one thing Malvika didn't mention is that hundreds of tribal day schools have been closed in the last few years on purpose. So it's a choice for children in a remote village. Either they go to a boarding school miles away from home, or they don't go to school at all. And what isn't happening, to sort of enormous frustration, is that there's almost no schools in this main part of India. Northeast is a bit different, as she said, where education is in the hands of the tribal people themselves. In fact, there's very few NGOs run by tribal people for tribal people. It's, you know, there are well-intentioned non-tribals, if you like us, who have got initiatives, but incredibly few tribal people themselves are doing this. It's almost like the mind has been so deeply colonized that in order to get an education, one has to become decolonized. And even anthropology in India is very kind of colonial in form. So I think we should go straight to questions now, because we've spoken too much. But I hope that gives a context of really kind of complicated. And there are these few tribal schools, many of which we've been to together or separately, that use the tribal languages and bring in the culture. But so few, less than 1% of tribal people are educated in their own language, and there is linguistic genocide happening. So complicated situation, but please ask questions.
Yeah. And I must add that also, given the about the question of this school hosting the World Anthropology Congress in 2023, a lot of academics and activists and organizations, both Adivasi and non-Adivasi, have got together and have put together a letter registering their dissent. and we are going to have a similar international letter of a kind, which would be circulated amongst anthropologists here.
Right.
To think about it more seriously, because if an organization like this hosts the World Anthropology Congress, then I think we need to rethink the role of anthropology and how that reflects on anthropology as a discipline. And IUAES, if you look at their website, their stated aim, one of the reasons for them setting themselves up was to subvert the role that anthropology has played in this colonial and Western mold. It was to challenge that. And for them to then have an organization like this host the Congress, it just doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things which I sort of learned looking at the IUAES website was that they are doing it in good faith to sort of decolonialize anthropology by looking at anthropology in different countries around the world. But one has to also keep in mind the power structure in place in the countries that they want to do this Congress in, and the political economy of those countries. So yeah, instead of just seeing all actors as equal.
I had a couple of points to add to. That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, Malvika. I'm so shocked about what you say about IES. We participated a few years ago in a World Congress when it was in England, in Manchester. Was it Manchester? Yes, Manchester. And I just can't understand. I mean, you're trying to, they're looking at the decolonization of anthropology, but it's shocking. It's absolutely shocking that would override Indigenous culture and advocate the destruction of Indigenous culture is just shocking. So I really think the Radical Anthropology Group would want to participate in resistance to that in whatever form. I just wanted to add a few words about the Hadza, because I have a little bit of background. The Hadza in Tanzania, where of course there's been since independence in Tanzania really a policy of Swahiliization, so that even though Indigenous groups always keep their own languages, there is this kind of umoja policy. And of course, the Hadza is one of the very last remaining African hunter-gatherers, still kind of bush living. They've been subject to a much smaller scale, but the same dynamics, whereby the children get bussed away to boarding schools where they're subject to great discrimination, punishment, very low level of education, shamed in terms of their culture, all the usual thing. And of course, they're seen as being very poor. Yeah. And yet those Hadza children have an extraordinary amount of knowledge and resilience and capacity for bush living and learning their own cultures. And that is having the effect of separating the children who've gone to school from the generation of their parents and causing alienation. And of course, it will churn out those Hadza children in a way that they're left at the bottom of the pile with very poor educational, and then losing, as you say, losing their bushcraft very much so, and being neither one thing nor the other. So it really echoes a lot of what you're describing for the Adivasi. That's so difficult. We're talking a lot with the Hadza parents, how much they wanted children to get education. And we're trying to work with youth groups in terms of how do we institute education in Hadza tongue, Hadza mother tongue? How do you do that? So it's very, very interesting to hear about these people who are so strongly advocating. Well, Gandhi himself, and then this amazing person, Elwin, I didn't know about, but that person must, I mean, wow, how far ahead of their time that guy was. So yeah, it's a lot of things to think about. Thank you for all this.
Great, thanks. Yeah. Yeah, one of the things I didn't mention I mean, lots of things I didn't mention in the talk. One of which is this sort of caste system of schooling that exists in India. You know, there's the caste system in society itself, but you see this caste system in schooling, and you see all these schools ranked. So they would set up these Ekalavya model residential schools for gifted tribal children, to teach them, to give them English language education, to kind of select them, put them in a different institution, to groom them in English, and so on. And this completely, as you're saying, goes completely against the ethos and the value system of the different tribal groups. So another thing I didn't mention with respect to their own systems of learning. I don't know, teaching. I mean, I feel odd using the word teaching, because I wouldn't know what those languages call these things themselves. So, and teaching certainly seems like an imposed idea. But one definitely learns that, you know, those systems of learning are organized on the principles of not being coercive, not being instructive, directive, and the rest of it. And I've already, in the few talks that I've attended with you all here, one sees that one learns about that more and more. And to sort of impose, and so one of the ways in which this was organized in central India was in an institution called a Ghotu, where you would have children of different age groups coming together in the evening after a day's work or play or whatever. I mean, again, you know, these kind of categories of work and play are not separate in the way we are so used to talking about them, and would share with each other stories, songs, dances, discuss any difficult issues which came up between them in sort of children's and youth assemblies, and the rest of it. And I'm sure there must have been a lot of politics in that as well. I mean, none of this is you know, none of these are like essential pure categories. There was life as usual with the rest of it, but the ways of negotiating that reality was much more democratic, really. So yeah, so on one end you have institutions like that, and then you have this caste system of schooling against it. And it just, yeah, the violence it does at all levels, as I said. And in India, we don't even talk about, you know, I mean, well, increasingly, I mean, there's fantastic work happening in India, and a lot more awareness on these issues. But to just talk about healing, you know, and you heal something only when you admit what has gone wrong. And in the case of Canada and Australia, you've at least had the prime ministers of these countries very belatedly, but at least accepting that this was their history and apologizing for it, and setting up truth and reconciliation commissions to sort of heal what happened, which would probably take another century or 2 or 3, who knows. But to just get the discussion going and get these processes going, and that's what I think a lot of us in India, in our different roles, are trying to do at the moment, really. And as Felix very rightly said, like the level of sort of fear that all of us feel in some way, and we are very aware of some of our friends who are actually, you know, at the front line of all of this, living in India. And it's, yeah, we're just faced with a power structure where you see a nexus between a very powerful Hindu nationalist state and extractive industries. And so, yeah, anyway, we can have more questions on whatever people would like. And yeah.
It wasn't so long ago that quite a few of us in the radical anthropology group experienced a minor taste of what Felix was referring to when he talked about the savagery of these mining companies. We, a bunch of us, decided to invade the headquarters right in central London of Xstrata, and we broke into the building, about a couple of hundred of us, or 100, with flares. We climbed right up, and we got to the roof, and we dropped a big banner over the edge of the roof, and all of this was in protest against the Xstrata Mining Corporation's desecration of an Australian Aboriginal sacred site. They dug up a river, they altered the course of the river. The Aborigines consider the river to be a living person connected with a rainbow snake. And yes, we were arrested, and there was quite a long period of in Westminster Magistrates Court. We had to go there day after day after day to plead that we were doing the right thing. Actually, the magistrate was pretty intelligent, and although the police did their damnedest to get us imprisoned, the magistrate said we did the right thing. We were correct to protest against Xstrata. But just sort of linked to that, I mean, what we've always thought in the radical anthropology group from the very beginning is that we need to accept the idea of the need for education. I mean, education is a really necessary thing. But of course, in the radical anthropology group, we always wanted to ask the question: who are the educators, and who are the people who very drastically need to be educated? So we've invariably turned everything right upside down, and with Jerome in particular, and Jerome Lewis, of course, with Mbengeli, egalitarian hunter-gatherer people and egalitarian people have got so much to show us about how to live in a sharing way, how to manage generate an egalitarian social structure, a very delicate challenge, how to live in harmony with the environment. I mean, these are all lessons which in the West we need to learn, and we need to be humble. And the teachers have to be these Indigenous people. And every university should be run by Indigenous people. Every school should be informed and inspired by Indigenous activists. And that means we have to know about we do need to know in detail about the traditions and the wisdom and the knowledge of Indigenous people. I'm not so happy about restricting ourselves to complaints and restricting ourselves to human rights issues. We need to go a lot further than that, and we need to think in terms of bringing down imperialism, bringing down what's left of colonialism. There's a huge amount of it left. I mean, the planet won't survive unless the whole edifice is brought down in some kind of everything. So what I sometimes miss.
Computer band you were sleeping.
What I sometimes miss is the details.
Yeah.
Clear those Indigenous voices. I'm not sure. Somebody had the microphone on. Perhaps it was unintentional. Maybe there's an argument going on in the kitchen or something.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I can see a question here by Atsan. Would they like to? And I don't fully understand. I just want to ask how self-discipline the kids gain when there is no system to examine their degrees. I'm not fully sure if I understand this. Atsan, would you like to speak? Okay.
I can hear, but I'm not sure what the child is saying.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, yes.
You're just talking about the school. I think the name was kids were taking education there, and there's no system to examine them. The teachers and the kids decide time schedule to decide which lessons they're going to learn, and they're not under a pressure to take an exam. So I just wonder, this is a very rare education system. When they, for example, when the time comes and they just want to continue their education at university, how do they gain? How do they have that self discipline to prepare for the university exams or for the high school exams, something like that?
Yeah, okay. So are you asking me this question in relation to the few examples that I showed, some positive examples that I showed?
Because I also checked on the internet that there were some really good quality universities in India, especially very good, excellent university, medicine university in Delhi. So if, for example, they want to continue to work on a professional area, how do they gain that self-system?
Okay,
That
thanks.
is-
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I think there are two questions almost in your question. One is to do with self-discipline, and I think which you're asking, okay, if these children are actually not sort of directed by teachers, then how do they develop a sense of self-discipline by themselves in a way? And one of the things that one learns from indigenous groups across the world and from Adivasis in India is that I don't know, again, whether the word discipline itself exists in any of the indigenous languages, because the idea very much is of, I mean, first of all, there's a lot of silence. There's a lot of learning which takes place through silent observation, and where there isn't the kind of chaos which we are used to, where the children are not listening and you need to like sort of run behind them and catch them and tell them to sit down, etc. Because of the value systems in such a society, there's quite an egalitarian relationship between an adult and a child, where an imposition of any kind doesn't exist, which fosters a sense of self, I don't know, an elegance or something, where the idea of discipline doesn't exist. And in terms of degrees, what you said, so the example of the school that I showed, again, all the learning is organized through an interaction between teachers and students, and to get professional, so the school itself doesn't have exams, but sort of like the A levels or the O levels that one understands here, the children would sort of go and take those exams independently through the national open schooling system and be fine in
Actually, in Finland, there is a kind of system. Children especially prefer the time breaks and the lessons,
yeah.
and the circle.
Yeah.
And so I think Chris also gave me the answer, because the children and all the students should bring themselves down to learn.
Yeah, exactly. It's about learning from children. It's about learning from indigenous groups, really. And as Chris was kind of hinting at this earlier, I personally have, in all these years, one thing that I have learned more and more is it's not only about the education or miseducation that's happening amongst indigenous communities through these schools. It's actually a loss for society at large and for the world at large, and it's the world which stands to benefit from, if the indigenous groups are generous enough, which they always are, to teach the rest of us, despite all the historical injustices that have happened in the colonial as well as post-colonial times. And I see that in the case of Ecuador, where the discussion from having an intercultural bilingual education system for indigenous groups has moved on to talking about interculturalizing the society. and hence you have an intercultural state. And they in practice are struggling, obviously, but at least in their discourse they've got an idea of interculturality, where the idea is that different cultures, different indigenous groups cultures also, because indigenous is not a blanket term, and all indigenous groups are not the same. They learn from each other, non-indigenous learn from indigenous, and we really cultivate interculturality, which is a very exciting but difficult thing to do. And I think it is really the need of our times if we were to be very serious about the idea of decoloniality at large. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I can see a hand raised here, if that's how it works. Debjyoti Das. Felix, feel free to add anything whenever.
No, it's great what you're saying. Debjyoti is there. He's a friend from Sussex University. Are you there, Debjyoti?
You've got your hand up.
Yeah, hello. Sorry, I could not unmute myself. So it's a very interesting presentation that you have made. I was interested to know about when you talked about the Northeast, which is quite unique from the rest of India, not only because of the Sikh schedule and kind of the spatial status that it enjoys, but also because of the colonial intervention, which took a different shape in the sense that to the rest of India. But what I was interested in this context was to understand how do you see the Adivasis who work as tea plantation workers in Assam, who are a completely estranged community at this point of time, because they live as the other within the broader pan-Assamese identity. So the Assamese people and other communities, indigenous communities in Assam, consider themselves to be the indigenous group, and the Adivasis as external entities who have come with the indentured labor regime. And how do you see their education? Because we know if you go to Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, and other parts of Northeast, the education level is quite kind of strong, in the sense the missionaries and the state are doing very well compared to the rest of India, Central India in particular. But what happens to the Adivasis, who compose a very significant population in the Assam Valley?
Yeah, great, thanks. Very good and very, very nuanced question. I mean, yes, absolutely. I think you know about a lot more about the Northeast than I do. But again, I would draw. So you say one thing, that the education level is very high in the Northeast. So from what I understand, yes, the literacy level is very high. But in terms of how education is, because literacy and education are not the same, and how education is and how people are in terms of their languages and being able to speak their languages with pride and freedom, I'm not very sure about that. That's one bit. The second bit, yes, this hierarchy between Adivasis and the Northeastern indigenous people is very much there. And here I really find Professor Virginius Khaka's work very interesting and useful, where he argues for, so indigeneity is very contested in India, as you and I know. And India has not ratified the Declaration for Indigenous People, etc., and the other ILO conventions pertaining to indigenous people in the world, because of this contestation around indigeneity. Right, and that's why I find Virginius Khaka's work very interesting, where he argues for the category of indigenous as a political category, which has the potential to bring Northeastern tribal people and Adivasis from Central India, as well as Adivasis working and living in Northeastern India, together to rally for protection of their land, forest, and other resources. So yes, I mean, I'm very aware of this hierarchy, and as a general point, not just with respect to Adivasis working on the tea plantations in the Northeast, but I think as a general idea, we need to think about education in a more contextualized, small-scale way, an education which responds to the physical and cultural ethos of each group Adivasi or not Adivasi. It applies to people living in big cities like Delhi, Bombay, and Bangalore as much as it would to Adivasi areas. Thanks.
Can I just add to that? Because
3 minutes left, Felix. Yeah.
okay, for people outside India, Northeast India is very complex because the Adivasis, the word means in Hindi first dwellers, but the British took them there. So there's conflict between the original tribes in Assam, for instance, or the Nagas and the Adivasis. So that's why the Northeasterners hate the term Adivasis and the complexity version from there. I just wanted to give that because it's, for people outside India, it's, tribal India is a complex thing.
Sure. And you see racism there as well between the Northeastern indigenous people and Adivasis there and the rest of it. It's complex, obviously. There are 2 questions here. I don't know. Well, we have 3 minutes left, so I don't know. I know very little about this. Are there circumstances in which Gandhi is basic? Yes, Gabriela, in short, yes. There are a few initiatives in small pockets here and there. Why did mainstream Indian researchers always categorize Northeastern indigenous people as distinct from other indigenous communities in India? Why they don't talk about the Northeastern tribes like Nagas, Mizos, Apatani, Kashi in the context of indigenous knowledge? What can I say? It's the same sort of hierarchy and this kind of silence and invisibility of the Northeast on the Indian mainland, as one calls it. It's a total invisibilization.
Talking about divide and rule, Northeasterners are inducted into the armed forces in Central India. Central Indian Adivasis are inducted into the armed forces in Northeast. So you can imagine it's very hard to make a platform, a common platform.
That's why Khaka's sort of argument for using indigenous as a political category and not so much as a primordial category, I think is very interesting and important.
Well, clearly this has to be just the start, because I mean, a lot of us are horribly, and I include myself here, horribly ignorant of the continent and its sufferings and treasures, of course. We've reached the end of our period for this evening. I just wanted to say this is the last lecture, the last talk, the last webinar of this term, and we're going to have a summer holiday. Unless there's a huge uproar of protests and somebody's got something in mind for next Tuesday, I feel that it probably is best to have a break. I mean, what do you think, Camilla? As a sort of co-organizer of these things, so far we haven't got a speaker for next week. That's what I'm saying.
We haven't got anything organized at this stage, so I think it's better to organize properly rather than ad hoc. But yeah, I think we don't know what's going to happen in September. Normally the Radical Anthropology Group would stop at the end of June and then start in September again. But we need to line up more fantastic speakers, some of the people who've been attending these seminars, perhaps for more talks.
Yeah.
Can I say to both of you, thank you for holding this space. It's absolutely, it's so refreshing. So, thanks to everybody for taking part.
That is great. So we'll be back. We usually come back about I don't know I haven't got a calendar in front of me, but whichever Tuesday is nearest to the 21st of September, we'll be back.
Yeah.
And please, yes, I mean,
I think we should ask people to make suggestions for more participants, and including some of the people who have been participating, to gain more speakers, because these are fantastic talks, and on the theme of decolonizing, this has been a very rich term, the whole series. And this talk's been one of the most fantastic. So thank you so much, Malvika and Felix.
Thank you so much, Camilla and Chris. Yeah, even though I feel like slightly split personality at the moment because of sort of thinking about different places, so it was difficult for me to get myself back into the Indian context in a deep way. Yeah, so sorry. Yeah, I mean, it could have been a lot more.
You did a great job with the Zoom. It was brilliant.
Gosh, I survived.
See you next term. See you in September. Thank you. Have a lovely time over the holidays. Bye, everybody.